There are so many ways for a DJ to transition from one song to the next, but for the beginner DJ, the options can be pretty daunting. In this video, we're gonna learn the first DJ transition that you should master, and it goes a little bit like this. Last week on DJ Essentials, we learned about phrase mixing, and during that episode, we did our first DJ transition. The basic DJ transition, where we phrase mix the outro of one song with the intro of the next song. Today, however, we're going to learn a little bit more about transitions, and specifically, we're going to learn how to do the bass shift transition. This is a transition where we swap the bass line of the current song with the next song coming in. But first, before we transition into anything, we have to learn about the EQ section. At first glance, the DJ mixer can look pretty intimidating with all these knobs and faders everywhere, but once we break it down, it's actually pretty easy to learn. So first, just a little refresher, we have the crossfader right here and the volume faders. The crossfader, just leave it right in the middle for this. The volume faders, what they do is they can control the volume of the current track you're playing, and setting it to somewhere at the 5 will be around 50% volume. The real meat and potatoes here is the EQ section, which are these three knobs right here. Let's start with the lows first. The lows control the low frequency band. So these are the baseline frequencies in the kick drum. And if we move it this way to the -26, it will cut out that frequency. And if we move it this way, it will increase that frequency, making them louder. So here's just a demonstration. If I move the fader to the left here, it completely cuts out that frequency. If I turn it to the right, it will increase that bass frequency. The mid-tone frequency controls the middle range, and that's mainly the vocals and most of the melody. So what that essentially means is it's the majority of the music is found in that mid-tone range. You can see if I move it to the right, that vocal becomes a little bit louder. And if I move it completely to the left, it cuts out that frequency completely. You can really see how much of a drastic change that can make affecting the mid-tone EQ band. Last but not least is the high frequency. These more affects the sort of hi-hat sound. So if you listen here, to an extent, this also affects the vocals and the melody as well, but this is primarily towards female vocals as they are higher pitched than male vocals. So above the EQ section, we have something called the trim knob, also known as the gain knob. What this trim knob acts as pre-fader volume. And what that means is volume that you can add and decrease before lowering and increasing the fader here. If you look at the volume indicator as we play the drop here, when we're playing music, we have this sort of visual guide here that tells us how loud we're pumping the volume. We don't want this red one to be completely lit all the time because that tells us that we're clipping. So we want to adjust it so that it's just sort of flashing occasionally, telling us that we're at the ceiling we want to go. Red typically means warning that you are clipping the mix. You don't want to clip the mix as you will introduce distortion. The trim knobs can be very useful to balance the two tracks so that they're playing at an even volume, so that when you're transitioning between one and the other, one is not louder than the other noticeably. Last thing to talk about in the mixer section here is the filter knob. Now in Rekordbox DJ, you can configure this filter knob to act in different ways, such as acting as a noise filter, but for the most part, it's gonna act as a low pass and a high pass filter. So think of this as the EQ section, but more general. So to break down this transition, I've actually added hot cues to 3 points in both tracks. And think of these as the steps to perform. The first step, step A, cue track 2 in your headphones with the volume all the way down and beat match. Step B is when we swap the basses. At first, this one will be completely cut, and then we swap the basses right here. And step C is when you cut out the first track and fully transition into the next track. So track 1's playing, and it's approaching hot cue A, and I know once we hit it, I'm supposed to cue track 2. Track 2's cued, I got a beat match now. You can see the mid-tone is raised slightly so that that vocal cuts into the mix a little bit. Introduce a little bit of high-pass filter. Adjust the EQ and swap the basses. The basses are swapped and I let this ride a little bit. It's sounding really nice. Right here is when I introduce high-pass filter to the exiting track. A little bit more right at the end, and I lower the volume. Now, even though we successfully just did the transition, there's one more thing we can do to add that extra bit of color to really make this transition pop, and that's with effects. So depending on the piece of hardware or controller you have, the effects section will be placed differently, but for this controller, it's placed right along this strip. The entire section. The main two things we really need to worry about are the on-off button, the level or depth slider, and this beat area that affects the timing of many effects. So let's talk about some common effects that DJs use, starting first with reverb. What reverb does is controls the size of the room that the track is playing in. Let's say you play music in a great hall. It's gonna bounce off and echo off the walls and make it sound larger than it is. The best way to really explain this is just by demonstration. Next, let's talk about echo. Now, echo differs from another effect called delay, as echo sort of replays a certain part of the track, but diminishes the volume each time it's played. The difference to that, as opposed to something like delay, delay simultaneously plays the audio over top itself and does not diminish. You can see it plays it over top itself, but it doesn't diminish like what echo does. It's good in quick bursts to add just a little bit of color to like a drop, for instance. Speaking of adding color to an existing song, a good way to use reverb, once again, is to, during a build-up towards a drop, initiate reverb to make the sound big and sort of fade out a little bit, to then bring back all that sound right when the drop. What this does is it makes it hit a lot harder. The build-up is playing approaching the drop. I turn on reverb. Starts getting pretty big. And right when the drop hits, I turn off the reverb and the drop just hits that much harder. So that's just a real basic rundown of some effects, but let's talk about how we can use effects to sort of heighten our transition. So with the effects, it's going to start the same process as before, but right when we do that bass swap, I'm going to introduce some effects. Once again, this track is playing and approaching cue point A, and I know I need to cue my next song right when we hit it. So I'm ready to cue. I cue and I beat match in my headphones. Introduce high pass filter. Adjust the EQ and swap the basses. Let it ride a little bit. Have my echo ready. Start to introduce it around here. That's going to do it for episode 3 of DJ Essentials, and next week we're going to go back to theory and tackle mixing in key. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe and turn on notifications, and comment down below if you have any questions. I'll be sure to answer them. For DJ Essentials, I've been Zeeshan, and I'll see you next time.